Now, here's Michael Smerconish.
What to make of Lauren Boebert and Ilhan Omar? We've got the right person to ask in Kyle Clark. He's an anchor reporter for 9 News in Denver, Colorado, recently making national news for a commentary that he's delivered on how the media is holding Congresswoman Boebert and others to a different, lesser set of standards. Most importantly, for our purposes, he's also an FOD. That would be friend of Dan. Hey, Kyle, it's nice to have you back on the program. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for the invitation.
Remind everybody, how do you know Dan and what stories can you share?
Dan and I were incarcerated together. No, we went to college together. Dan and I went to Ithaca College together years ago, and we've made the unfortunate life choice to stay connected.
Ithaca really is a serious school for students who want to pursue careers in journalism, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Yeah. And they're very hands-on. They were when Dan and I went there, and they are to this day. It's really cool. Any freshman can walk in week 1 and say, I want to audition for the radio station. And it takes a certain amount of excessive confidence to do that. But Dan and I both had it. So that's how we ended up on the radio.
Well, Kyle had the looks. I had the radio voice. So that's why I'm at SiriusXM and he's on TV at 9 News.
Well, people will have to watch on YouTube to be the judge of that. Dan, were you always on a radio path? And Kyle, were you always on a TV path?
Yes, absolutely. Started radio and using my voice back in middle school.
Yeah,
how about you, Kyle?
I was going to go into sports radio, but I was always a news nerd. I was always a politics junkie. And at the end of the day, I looked around and said, looks like there's a lot more news jobs than there are sports jobs. So let's double down on news.
So I'm so glad to have you here because I'm eager to talk about this controversy, but let's set it up together if we may. I think the chronology is that it was actually Thanksgiving, right? It was last Thursday that this video comes out from Colorado Congresswoman Lauren Boebert. What was the context? What was going on in that video? I'll play it after you describe it.
Certainly. So my commentary saying that we hold her to a lower standard because of the fact that she traffics in cruel, false, and bigoted comments actually came out before this most recent video in which she's speaking at a November 20th event in Pueblo, Colorado. And she makes what sounds like she's telling a story about getting in an elevator with Representative Ilhan Omar with concerns that she might be a suicide bomber. My commentary actually predated that by a few days about another anti-Muslim remark that she made about Omar on the U.S. House floor, where she called her jihad squad and so on and so forth. But the fact that she made this new comment days later just kind of, it speaks to what I'm discussing, which is that she does this so constantly. Journalists are forced to either ignore it and therefore incentivize her and other politicians to do it more often, or make our news every night about the outrageous things Lauren Boebert says.
And obviously the point you're making is this was not a one-off. Like this is part and parcel of what she does. It's not as if, I don't know, she had an excited utterance and made a statement that she later regretted. She made a conscious decision to go back to the well. Before I play the tape, do we know where she is and to whom she's speaking in the video that was released on Thanksgiving or that came out on Thanksgiving?
Sure. So that came out from Democratic operatives with Patriot Takes. And we're still trying to figure out, is it tracker audio or a video, or is it supporter video that was put out there? Because you can hear people in the room laughing at the racist jokes. And it's a little bit tough to tell whether the person holding the camera is laughing along as well. But her team obviously confirmed the fact that this happened because she came out and offered a half-hearted apology before she got on a call and mixed things up again with Representative Omar.
I'm going to get to that in a second. Okay, for the benefit of those, you really need to watch this. Go to YouTube or wherever and watch it. But here's you'll get the impact from the sound. Roll it.
Actually, I have an Ilhan story for you. So, So the other night on the House floor was not my first jihad squad moment. So I was getting into an elevator with one of my staffers, and he and I we're leaving the Capitol. We're going back to my office, and we get in the elevator, and I see a Capitol police officer running hurriedly to the elevator. I see fret all over his face, and he's reaching, and I'm like, "What? I can't. The door's shutting. Like I can't open it. Like what's happening?" I look to my left, And there she is, Ilhan Omar.
Oops.
And I said, well, she doesn't have a backpack. We should be fine.
Hey, Kyle, what did you think when you saw that, given that you had already delivered a commentary that was resonating on her prior statement?
To be honest with you, I mean, that is Representative Boebert on any day that ends in day. I mean, that's what she does. That's her brand. That's what she ran on. That appears to be her strategy for governance. That is just what she does. Folks in Colorado were well acquainted with it. I think folks on the national scene are now as well.
And she represents what in Colorado speak is the Western Third. Did I say it right?
Sure. Western slope or Western third of the state. It's a geographically enormous district, one that has represented Democrats and Republicans over the years. It's recently been redrawn into a safe seat for her.
So then comes Friday, she sends out a tweet and it says, I apologize to anyone in the Muslim community I offended with my comment about Representative Omar. I have reached out to her office to speak with her directly. There are plenty of policy differences to focus on without this unnecessary distraction. Was that an apology?
To be honest with you, I would leave the apology judging up to the folks who were directly attacked, meaning Representative Omar, and then those who were directly impacted, most particularly Muslim Americans. I don't think it's really my place as a white guy who doesn't live in her district to judge the apology. I think a lot of people found it lacking, and it appeared to just be a pretense to get on this call to then argue with Representative Omar, which, again, at the risk of restating my point, this is what she does, and this is the challenge for journalists who try to cover her.
Right. And to your point, then yesterday, Marjorie Taylor Greene wants in on the action because she releases a Twitter thread, several of them beginning this way. If Democrats move against Lauren Boebert, who apologized, they'll only help Lauren and reveal their true nature. Ilhan Omar committed immigration fraud by repulsively marrying her brother, reveres, spelled incorrectly, Al-Qaeda, refers to 9/11 Islamic terror attack as some people did something. I'm sure that tweet, that Twitter thread was probably a fundraising bonanza for Marjorie Taylor Greene, which I maintain is a large measure of what these folks are really all about. These incendiary, despicable comments are a fundraising bonanza.
I agree in the sense that I think that the reason why this is the strategy is because it pays off in terms of attention and fundraising. And the question then for journalists becomes, do we increase the harm done specifically by the disinformation and by the bigotry if we re-amplify it through coverage, or do we create a separate problem if we intentionally don't cover it, therefore depriving Coloradans who live on the Western Slope of a true picture of what their representative does for the money they pay her?
And what is your answer to that provocative question?
So my answer is, I don't have the solution, but that can no longer stop us from talking about the problem publicly. I think national journalists and commentators have grappled with this throughout the Trump years of what to do with somebody who knowingly says cruel, false, and bigoted things for attention, and who makes that their brand, and who so floods the zone with that type of thing that they basically get a bulk discount for bigotry. My point is that if most elected officials say something, the likes of which Lauren Boebert says nearly daily, if they say it once, we would rake them over the coals because they are supposed to be decent people. She, on the other hand, is allowed to do it daily and is almost incentivized to do it. And journalists are put in this conundrum. I think this time around, local journalists across the country must be more involved in figuring out a solution and a workable way to cover these politicians. And we need to do it publicly. We need to tell our communities, we're struggling with this. This is what your elected representative does. How should we together figure out how to handle this?
The problem is that in certain parts of the country where, and it's not just Lauren Boebert alone. I'm thinking of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm thinking of Representative Gosar. We just had this conversation about Gosar from Arizona after he put out that anime against Ocasio-Cortez. And the more you talked about it, the more you seemed to be fundraising for him. Or Steve Bannon, I mean, Steve Bannon, who now has filed a motion where he says to the Justice Department, I want everything litigated in the public. I made the comment, Kyle, that when he was indicted, it was probably the happiest day that he's had since Trump was elected, because it keeps him in the spotlight and allows him to continue to fundraise for his various causes. So I get the issue that you're presenting. It's very complicated. On one hand, you feel as a journalist, you've got to talk about this and shine a light on it. On the other hand, you don't want to benefit the people whose conduct is so abhorrent.
And I think in what ends up happening then in local newsrooms, where resources are stretched, a lot of folks are not covering politics full time. What happens is there's a tendency to either ignore the things that these elected officials say, or to fall into predictable kind of both sides coverage. You know, here's what Representative Boebert said, and then here's what somebody else says about it, as opposed to stating clearly, like, this is bigotry. Like, this is bigotry against people who live in our community. Or in other instances, like, this is a lie. This is disinformation, which serves a purpose to mislead people. And I think a lot of local journalists are very uncomfortable calling that out, in the same way that we saw national journalists challenged by this question 5 years ago. And it's time for us in the backwaters, then no backwater. It's time for us in the backwaters to step up and take responsibility for how our journalism can have an impact.
And I would just add to that, because I agree with what you've said, that you've got to be a fair arbiter of this kind of treatment. If Ilhan Omar, in the context of talking about Israel, says it's all about the Benjamins, you must call her out similarly, or you're being hypocritical.
And I think the challenge for local journalists is to sort through what of that is fair and what of it is whataboutism. Because in the sense, I cover Colorado politics, so I cover Lauren Boebert, and I'll hear people say, well, you know, you didn't spend 3 minutes talking about Ilhan Omar. And it's like, well, yes, she's a congresswoman from Minnesota. From a national news outlet, that is absolutely a fair expectation. What Coloradans should expect of me is to apply an equal and fair standard to all elected officials in the state, Democrats and Republicans, and to hold them to it. It is not journalist responsibility if, say, in Colorado on any given day, only one person crosses that line, and then the same person crosses that line.
Totally fair. Totally fair. And whomever is on your beat in Minnesota should be providing the same level of coverage to Omar. So I kind of buried the lead. What do we know relative to the phone call that the two of them had yesterday?
So we have each of their individual accounts about the phone call. I'll state this right off the bat. I chose not to report on the phone call yesterday. I talked about that decision on social media briefly, but we did not talk about it on air at all, because it appears to me like the whole apology set up for the phone call was simply a pretense for Representative Boebert to repeat her bigotry and to insult Representative Omar again. I'm not particularly interested in a back and forth between the two of them, particularly because I think that reduces what we should be talking about, at least as it applies to Colorado, which is, what is your representative doing for a living, and how does her bigotry and disinformation impact the community? So what we know, what each of them said, is that they got on this phone call. Boebert calls Omar and said, hey, listen, I apologize on Twitter, or something of the like. Representative Omar requests a public apology, to which Representative Boebert said that she replied that no, she wanted Representative Omar to apologize for her anti-police sentiments, so on and so forth. Representative Omar hangs up the call, and thus is born another news cycle in the life of America. We chose not to participate in that last night.
So I respect that decision on your part. I'm not going to play the whole video, but I do want to play a piece of the video so that people can hear exactly what Boebert said, because one part of it jumped out at me, and I suspect at you as well. Roll that.
This is Lauren with a quick update on a phone call I had today with squad member Ilhan Omar. I had reached out to her Friday, and 3 days later, I was able to connect with her on the phone because I wanted to let her know directly that I had reflected on my previous remarks. Now, as a strong Christian woman who values faith deeply.
As soon as I heard that, we don't even need to hear the rest. When I heard her invoking her faith, I thought, well, here she goes again, trying to present this dichotomy of sorts where, well, she's the follower of Islam and I'm the Christian in all of this, when what in the world did that have to do with any of this? You're either apologizing or you're not. You get the final word, and thank you so much for being so gracious to come on and talk about how you've handled this issue.
Well, I think you're correct. Subtlety is not part of how this works. And I would just challenge all the folks listening to reconsider how folks like this are covered in their community. Talk to your local journalists about this. Support local journalists who are willing to call lies, lies, and are willing to call bigotry, bigotry, and raise the expectation for the local journalists in your community that they're not going to leave these tough conversations to national political reporters, okay? We have a role to play too on the local level of calling this out and figuring out how to best cover it in a way that is not corrosive to democracy if we're talking about disinformation, and not corrosive to our communities if we're talking about bigotry. But it's time that we step up in the way the national media.
Kyle, my audience has heard it from me ad nauseum, but I'll say it one more time. And it's part of a speech that's now, I delivered at the Reagan Library 2 months ago, that's posted on my YouTube channel. I make the point there. It used to be that the way you got ahead in Washington was you were elected, bided your time, tried to get choice committee assignments, passed legislation, and had achievements. Now you say something incendiary, and Boebert is such a great example of what I'm talking about. You become a fundraising magnet. Somehow the constituents don't seem to hold you accountable for not making legislative process, but because you fundraise, you get reelected again and again, which seems to me to be their sole objective, not to accomplish, just to stay in Washington. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Next time, come back and tell more Dan stories, okay?
All right, will do. Thanks for the invite. Appreciate your time.